Opening the center immediately aims for space and development, setting up potential early skirmishes. Establishing a flexible pawn chain. 1. d6 opens lines for the bishop while preparing for a solid, unhurried development. Developing the knight here immediately eyes the center and prepares for castling, a sound positional stepping stone. Developing the bishop to g4 pins the knight, potentially creating tactical opportunities or forcing a pawn advance. Tightening the pawn center now, white aims to solidify central space and restrict black's developing pieces. Embracing the fianchetto, black aims for robust kingside defense, but compromises central pawn control. Positioning the queen aggressively eyes the queenside, creating immediate pressure and potentially exploiting weaknesses in black's nascent development. Developing the queenside and preparing to fianchetto, the bishop offers active counterplay against white's central pressure. Aggressively pushing the h-pawn creates weaknesses around white's king, potentially opening lines for black's pieces later. Retreating the bishop frees up the c8 square, allowing for a more harmonious development of the queenside pieces and preparing to challenge white's central control. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies control over the central squares, particularly e4, and prepares to castle kingside, aiming for king safety while maintaining flexibility in white's pawn structure, which could see support for a future e4 push. Reinforcing the fianchetto structure solidifies control over the long diagonal and prepares for potential queenside maneuvering, but it does leave the kingside slightly less defended against immediate pawn thrusts. Seizing the center with authority, white dramatically increases the pressure along the e-file and prepares to launch an assault towards the black king. This bold step aims to restrict black's pieces and create immediate imbalances, forcing a decisive reaction rather than allowing a leisurely development. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for potential pawn pushes in the center, simultaneously offering support to the d6 pawn. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle, this move also eyes the vulnerable b7 square while developing a key piece towards the kingside, hinting at potential attacking ideas. Developing the knight to f6 reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares for castling, a crucial step for king safety and activating the rook. This natural development also allows black to contest the e4 pawn more effectively and potentially eye the queenside later on. Cementing control over the central light squares, this piece finds a safe haven, preparing for a potential kingside castling ballet and reinforcing the pawn chain's defensive integrity. Finally, bringing the king to safety offers immediate relief from the looming pressure on the queenside, allowing for a more robust development of black's kingside battery and freeing up the rook for potential central action. Castling locks down your king behind a pawn shield and prepares to connect your rooks, creating a cohesive defensive structure while opening avenues for future action, a solid step in consolidating your position. Embracing central conflict, black immediately challenges white's pawn chain and opens lines for their bishop and queen. This is a bold bid to disrupt white's smooth development and seize initiative, though it does concede the d5 square and potentially creates a backward d-pawn if white can manage the ensuing pawn exchange carefully. The position is now poised for dynamic play as both sides jostle for control of the critical central squares. Liberating the d-file opens lines for white's rooks, potentially creating pressure along it, while simultaneously challenging black's central pawn structure and creating an immediate tactical confrontation that needs careful assessment from black. The central pawn structure has just been fundamentally altered, and your decision to recapture with the e-pawn immediately opens lines towards the king's defenses and creates a dynamic pawn chain. Observe how this recapture influences the pawn islands and the available squares for both sets of pieces. Opening the central file for the rook offers a direct challenge to black's e5 pawn, potentially forcing a pawn exchange that would grant white a central majority and pressure on the d-file. Seeking a more robust defensive posture and potentially preparing a queenside maneuver, this redirection of the queen from the c8 square initiates a subtle reshuffling of black's royal court. Pushing the c-pawn here aggressively contests the center and aims to disrupt black's kingside setup, potentially creating a weakness on b6 or even opening lines towards the queen. This bold advance sacrifices a touch of pawn structure for increased dynamism and space on the queen side, forcing black to react and potentially defend a less comfortable position. A surprisingly active retreat for the knight, aiming to reposition it to a more dynamic square and potentially eye the c4 pawn's defense, while also clearing the f6 square for future possibilities, and daringly challenging white's central pawn chain with positional maneuvering rather than immediate confrontation. Dominating the central dark squares with the knight, this piece now exerts pressure on black's queen side and eyes the weak f6 square, potentially disrupting coordination. Opening the bishop's diagonal and sacrificing material to disrupt white's central control, this capture initiates a sharp tactical skirmish where black aims to exploit the exposed queen and weakened light squares, gambling that the subsequent activity will compensate for the pawn deficit and create long-term attacking chances against the white king. White decisively seizes the initiative by infiltrating the queen side and creating immediate pressure on black's fractured pawn structure. This aggressive placement of the bishop not only opens lines for potential battery formations along the c-file, but also forces black into a reactive posture, questioning the long-term safety of their king as defenders are drawn away from the center. Shifting the rook from the queen side to the central e-file anticipates a potential pawn break and aims to bolster the defense of the king side from its current exposed position, seeking to create a more cohesive unit for future maneuvers. Rack 1 intensifies pressure along the open c-file, preparing to exploit any weakness in black's queenside pawn structure and forcing black to confront the central tension directly. Unleashing the rook onto the open b-file dramatically amplifies pressure along the flank, a crucial counterpoint to white's central dominance and potentially threatening to dislodge the compromised c5 bishop or even probe the queenside defenses. Seeking to exploit the light square weaknesses that have emerged on the queen side, white repositions the queen to the attacking file, eyeing potential threats against black's vulnerable castled king, while simultaneously creating a flexible platform for further central pressure. Pivoting the knight to f4, black initiates a subtle but potent positional gamble, directly challenging white's control over the critical e3 square and aiming to disrupt the harmony of white's piece development by offering a knight exchange. This maneuver, while seemingly aggressive, introduces a layer of complexity, forcing white to consider not only immediate defensive necessities, but also the long-term ramifications on pawn structure and central influence. The knight's repositioning creates potential forks and pin opportunities, particularly if white decides to maintain their pawn on c5. Moreover, it might herald a subsequent pawn push on the king side, leveraging the knight's new outpost. The question now is whether white can skillfully parry these threats, or if black will find themselves overextended. Striking at the heart of black's pawn structure, this bishop repositioning aims to sever the f6 knight's connection to the center and probe the weakened dark squares around the monarch, potentially initiating a kingside attack by forcing concessions or creating new targets for white's pieces. Shifting the queen to d8 clears the d-file for the rook, preparing to contest it, but it also potentially surrenders control of the c7 square and limits the queen's active deployment, leaving it rather passive for now. Clearing the path for the knight to potentially leap into the center, this repositioning of the rook aims to free up the d-file for more dynamic action and prepares to contest the c-file with increased vigor. This repositioning of the knight to e6 aims to bolster the center and challenge white's dominant bishop on a6, potentially leading to exchanges that ease black's cramped position. The bishop now anchors itself, surveying the central expanse and subtly reinforcing the pawn chain's integrity while simultaneously threatening to exploit any weakness on the queen side. The knight's audacious leap to d4 injects immediate dynamism, challenging white's centralized pieces and aiming to disrupt their carefully constructed pawn structure. This maneuver seeks to exploit the slight overextension of white's pieces, particularly the queen, by creating immediate tactical possibilities and potentially opening lines for counterplay. It's a bold statement, signaling a desire to steer the game away from passive maneuvering and towards sharp, dynamic exchanges, forcing white to react decisively to maintain their advantage. Reclaiming central control, white forcibly exchanges knights to unravel black's surprisingly passive setup, potentially opening lines for attack or simplifying into an advantageous endgame. Pivoting the knight to d4 forcefully challenges the control of the central squares and initiates a crucial tactical skirmish, potentially unraveling white's bishop-pair advantage and creating dynamic counterplay on the queen side if black can maintain pressure. Suddenly, the game explodes into a tactical frenzy as white clears the critical central diagonal, forcing a decisive exchange that reshapes the board's complexion. Black liberates a crucial knight, immediately challenging white's entrenched bishop and disrupting the pawn chain's integrity. Sacrificing a pawn to pry open the queenside and expose black's king is a daring gambit, aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn structure. Seizing the open c-file, black aims to neutralize white's advanced queen and develop a counterattacking presence along the queenside, hoping to disrupt the coordination of white's pieces. A bold repositioning, this knight aims to establish a crucial outpost on d5, potentially dominating the center and creating threats against black's king if it can secure its position there. Reclaiming control of the file with the rook aims to contest white's advanced queen and potentially harass the weak back rank, injecting life into a position that was starting to feel stifled. Repositioning the queen from the attacked square, this maneuver aims to re-establish pressure along the c-file and potentially eye weaknesses on the queen side, while offering a timely retreat should black's knight on d4 prove too menacing. The queen's relocation prepares for a potential breakthrough on the queen side, aiming to contest the open c-file and challenge white's control over critical squares. Reclaiming central control, the knight pivots from the queenside skirmish, aiming to solidify white's pressure and potentially support advances on the kingside or queenside. An audacious pawn sacrifice, the rook suddenly feels quite exposed on the open file. A sharp counterthrust aiming to dismantle black's king's defenses and exploit the weakened dark squares. Black redirects attacking energy, seeking to untangle the queenside pressure and activate the queen for defensive duties. Unlocking the e-file for the rook with the queen's repositioning is a fascinating strategic gamble, seeking to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king. Shifting the bishop to the edge, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawns and potentially threaten along the light squares, hints at a desire to untangle black's pieces and create more dynamic possibilities, perhaps even preparing a future. bc8 to activate the previously passive queen's bishop. Asserting control over the queenside and preparing to bring the rook into active play on the now open c-file is the underlying idea, though it concedes significant central influence to black's knight. Initiating a pawn advance on the kingside often signals a desire to disrupt the opponent's defensive structure, potentially opening lines for an attack or creating space for your own pieces. Unlocking the queenside and asserting control over the open b-file is the primary goal, as the pawn chain on the kingside offers a degree of stability. Harnessing the newly opened h-file, black pushes forward, seeking to dismantle white's central control and exploit the king's potential exposure, a bold gambit aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and create unforeseen complications. Unlocking the queenside's potential, this maneuver seeks to displace black's rook and create opportunities for infiltration or pressure on the exposed pawn structure. Safeguarding the rook's retreat path with the bishop adds a layer of defensive solidity, a necessary precaution given white's queen's aggressive probing on the queenside and the looming potential of the knight on d4. This repositioning of the queen to the 7th rank opens up the diagonal for the bishop and creates a persistent threat against the black king, forcing black to constantly defend rather than develop their own counterplay. The rook's return to the open c-file finally challenges white's control, aiming to dislodge the aggressive queen and potentially exploit the doubled pawns that now adorn black's position. Opening the queenside to potentially exploit the pin on the e-pawn, while simultaneously threatening to create havoc with the queen and knight pair should black be careless. Black is daring to push the rook forward, hoping to exploit the potential overextension of white's queen on a5 and perhaps create some counterplay down the open a file. It's a bold maneuver that could either unlock tactical opportunities or leave the rook stranded if white finds a swift response. The queen now repositions, seeking a more active role, perhaps eyeing the weakened dark squares on black's queen side or preparing a swift, regrouping to exploit the central tension that still exists despite the material exchange. Unlocking the c-file's potential hinges on this development, preparing to contest it and challenge white's precarious king's safety. Initiating a maneuver to regain control over the crucial c-file, this rook redeployment aims to challenge black's established presence and prepare for potential breakthroughs. Finally, a shift in focus occurs as the queen repositions, seeking active squares and aiming to disrupt white's potentially harmonious pieces. Reuniting the rooks on the e-file opens up possibilities for creating batteries and coordinating attacks, particularly against the king side if the opponent remains passive. Seeking to consolidate material advantage and prepare for a potential endgame, black chooses a quiet maneuver to reposition the queen, aiming to add pressure along the third rank and potentially support a pawn advance, while simultaneously keeping the option open to defend the vulnerable king side if white finds a way to attack there. Unlocking the central files for rook activity is paramount. The exchange on e4 clears the way for white's rooks to potentially dominate the open lines and exert pressure on black's exposed king. Reclaiming the sacrificed bishop decisively simplifies into a favorable endgame, where black's active queen and centralized king offer excellent counterplay against white's somewhat exposed monarch. Seizing the open file with the rook allows white to re-establish pressure and coordinate pieces toward the weakened black king. Befriending the passed pawn, the bishop prepares to escort it forward, potentially igniting a dangerous attack down the file if white isn't careful. Preparing to launch a decisive assault, the queen repositions, seeking optimal cutting angles towards black's exposed monarch, while simultaneously supporting any pawn advances that might crack open the central defense. Shifting the queen to d8 aims to protect the vulnerable pawn on d4 and prepare for potential counterplay along the d-file, while also keeping an eye on white's king's safety. A forced exchange on d8 simplifies the position, removing the queen that was a dynamic piece and heralding the transition to a pawn-down endgame where black's rook will face significant pressure. Rethinking the rook exchange at this precise moment, as the dust settles from the double bishop sacrifice, black reclaims their rook, aiming to reposition it actively on the now open d-file and disrupt white's central control. Pushing the pawn forward initiates a potential breakthrough, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup and gain crucial space on the queen side as the game transitions into an endgame. The knight's relocation to the edge of the board on a8 appears to be a positional concession, sacrificing valuable central influence and active participation in the unfolding skirmish. This maneuver leaves black's queenside somewhat exposed and potentially vulnerable to future incursions by white's activated pieces, while the knight itself languishes on an inactive square, a stark contrast to its earlier aggressive intentions. Pushing the pawn forward now creates an immediate, unmissable challenge, forcing black to confront the encroaching threat directly rather than continuing with passive maneuvering. Shifting the king toward the queen side offers a sliver of breathing room, a proactive measure to escape the growing pressure along the open files, and potentially prepare for future pawn advances or a centralized king position. Propelling the knight to the center creates an immediate outpost. A knight positioned here can exert influence across a vast swathe of the board, potentially targeting weaknesses in black's pawn structure and the king's vicinity, while also freeing up other pieces for more active roles. Exchanging that bishop might seem like a simplification, but it sacrifices tempo and allows white to solidify their central control and push that advanced passed pawn unimpeded. The rook's repositioning to the 7th rank injects immediate pressure, eyeing potential discoveries and threatening to dismantle black's pawn structure. Unlocking the d-file's potential, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's centralized piece formation and create dynamic possibilities, potentially forcing concessions or opening lines for black's rook. Focusing on the king's newly exposed position, This commitment to moving the monarch toward the center, despite the lingering dangers on the board, aims to activate it for potential endgame operations and provide a safer haven from the enemy's active pieces. The pawn's journey to the 7th rank, a potent threat now looming, forces a decisive reaction from white. This immediate king repositioning is a crucial attempt to secure the monarch before the passed pawn becomes an insurmountable threat, though it opens a potential diagonal for the opponent's remaining pieces. Embracing the inevitable endgame, this maneuver thoughtfully repositions the rook to confront white's advancing pawn, a crucial defensive action that aims to contain the unleashed queen's side play. Rescuing the bishop from its exposed diagonal, this repositioning aims to solidify the pawn structure and prepare for a potential queenside push, though it allows black to consolidate their passed pawn. Sacrificing the pawn to open lines for the rook and potentially activate the bishop. This pawn push aims to gain significant central space and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure on the queenside, creating new weaknesses. Unleashing the bishop to the exposed king creates a sudden tactical crisis, forcing a king escape or a concession of material to protect against immediate threats. The king bravely steps into the fray, a bold declaration that the central struggle is now directly under royal supervision. Seizing the opportunity, black recaptures the pawn, aiming to exploit the compromised pawn structure on the queenside and potentially activate their rook.